In the pale dawn light, silence falls over a muddy French battlefield broken only by the ragged breaths of waiting men. It is July the 1st, 1916, on the Somme. In waterlogged trenches, thousands of British soldiers steel themselves, bayonets fixed, knuckles white around their rifles. The air reeks of damp earth and cordite from the relentless artillery barrage that has pounded enemy lines through the night. A whistle blows sharply, ladders are thrown up, and men scramble over the parapet into no man's land, hearts pounding. Almost at once, machine guns open fire, scything down row after row of soldiers as they advance across cratered ground. By nightfall, 20,000 lie dead, the single bloodiest day in British military history. This is only the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, and just one scene from a conflict that has already raged for 2 years. World War I, known then as the Great War, is a cataclysm engulfing the globe, a war on a scale and of a brutality never before seen. How did the world arrive at this nightmare? To answer that, we must turn back the clock to the summer of 1914, when the first sparks of this global inferno were lit. In the early 20th century, Europe is a tinderbox of rivalries and fears. Empires dominate the continent: Imperial Germany, France, Britain, Austria, Hungary, and Russia eye each other warily, each determined to protect its interests and prestige. Decades of militarism and arms races have built armies numbering in the millions and battleships of unprecedented might. Complex alliances bind the powers, Germany and Austria. Hungary stand together in the Triple Alliance, along with Italy, which for now remains non-committal. Across the continent, France aligns with Russia, and both count on Britain's support in the Triple Entente. Nationalism is surging as well. Ethnic groups seek independence and nations pursue glory. France smolders over the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, lost to Germany in a war 40 years earlier. Britain feels challenged by Germany's rapid rise and naval ambitions. Russia sees itself as the guardian of Slavic peoples, including Serbia, which chafes under the shadow of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All the ingredients for a great conflict are in place. It only needs a trigger. That trigger comes on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife Sophie ride through the sunny streets in an open car visiting this restive province. Crowds line the route, guarded by uneasy Austro-Hungarian troops. Suddenly, shots crack out. A young Bosnian Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, steps forward and fires his pistol, killing the royal couple. In an instant, their blood on the Sarajevo pavement sets off a chain reaction across Europe. Shocked and enraged, Austria-Hungary sees the assassination as a plot by neighboring Serbia. The empire, longing to quash the Serbian threat and assert its fading authority, issues a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia agrees to most demands, but balks at one that would let Austrian officials operate on Serbian soil, fearing it would lose its sovereignty. Unsatisfied, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination. The July crisis spirals out of control. The delicate web of alliances pulls one nation after another into the fray. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, bound by treaty and pan-Slavic sympathies, orders his vast but ill-prepared army to mobilize in defense of Serbia. This alarms Russia's neighbor and rival Germany, which is allied to Austria-Hungary and sees Russian mobilization as a direct threat. On August 1, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany declares war on France as well, executing a long-held strategy to avoid war on 2 fronts by striking France swiftly first, then turning east to face the slower-moving Russians. To reach France, German forces violate the neutrality of Belgium, marching through its flat countryside to outflank French defenses. This invasion of a small, neutral nation outrages Britain, which is bound by treaty to protect Belgium. On August 4, 1914, Britain declares war on Germany. In a matter of days, the great powers of Europe are at war. Only Italy sits out for now, claiming its alliance with Germany and Austria was defensive and does not bind it to join their aggression. Beyond Europe, other nations take sides. Japan, eyeing German colonies in Asia, joins the Allies in late August. The Ottoman Empire, courted by Germany, signs a secret alliance and will soon enter on the side of the Central Powers. A regional clash in the Balkans is now a world war. Across Europe, the news of war is initially met with parades and patriotic fervor. In every capital, throngs cheer under fluttering national flags, convinced their side's cause is just, and victory will be swift. Young men rush to recruiting stations, afraid the war will end before they can join the adventure. They carry with them romantic notions of warfare, visions of cavalry charges and swift maneuvers. Leaders on all sides fan this optimism. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, clad in glittering uniform, tells his departing soldiers, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." Many in Britain confidently believe it will be over by Christmas. Few understand the storm they are rushing into. Amid the jubilation, one voice offers a somber note. In London, British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey stands at his window on the eve of Britain's entry into the war, watching gas lamps being lit along the street as dusk falls. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime," Grey murmurs. His poetic warning proves all too true. The light of peace is dimming, and a long night of war begins. In the first weeks of combat, the war does move swiftly, but not to a quick conclusion. Germany's armies pour into Belgium and northern France in a vast wheeling maneuver known as the Schlieffen Plan, aiming to encircle and crush the French army and capture Paris from the north. At first, it seems to be working. The German forces, led by generals such as Alexander von Kluck and Karl von Bülow, win brutal Battle of the Frontiers fights in late August 1914, pushing back the French and the small British expeditionary force that has landed to aid France. The German columns advance to within 30 miles of Paris, close enough that the city's lights and the Eiffel Tower are almost in sight. The French government flees the capital in panic. But in early September, in a last desperate effort, the French commander General Joseph Joffre rallies his troops for a counterattack along the Marne River. In the First Battle of the Marne, French soldiers famously raced to the front in Parisian taxicabs, rushed from the city to plug gaps in the line. For 6 days, the battle rages. Finally, against all odds, the Franco-British forces halt the German advance and even push the invaders back some miles. Paris is saved. Germany's plans for a quick victory in the West are shattered. Having failed to break through, the Germans and Allies now try to outflank each other in a series of maneuvers that gallop northwest toward the sea, a contest known as the Race to the Sea. Neither side can gain a decisive advantage. By late 1914, both armies begin hastily digging trenches for shelter. What began as a war of movement has frozen into stalemate. A continuous line of trenches soon stretches from the Swiss border in the south all the way to the Belgian coast. Hundreds of miles of zigzagging earthworks, barbed wire entanglements, and fortified strongpoints. On the Western Front, a new kind of war has emerged, a grinding trench warfare of attack and counterattack, where gains are measured in yards and victories counted by bodies rather than territory. The soldiers, who had marched off in bright uniforms singing patriotic songs in August, now find themselves mired in mud and horror by winter. Even as the Western Front bogs down, fighting erupts on other fronts. To the east, the vast armies of Russia collide with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Russia, though huge in number, is poorly equipped and led. In August 1914, 2 Russian armies surge into German East Prussia, catching Germany off balance. In response, Germany rushes reinforcements by train and places the formidable duo of General Paul von Hindenburg and his brilliant strategist deputy, Erich Ludendorff, in charge. In late August, they encircle and annihilate one of the Russian armies at the Battle of Tannenberg, inflicting a catastrophic defeat. Tens of thousands of Russians are killed or captured, and their commander commits suicide in shame. Shortly after, the Germans smash the Second Russian Army at the Masurian Lakes. These victories make national heroes of Hindenburg, and Ludendorff and blunt the Russian threat to Germany's eastern border. Further south, Austria-Hungary fumbles in its invasion of Serbia. The outnumbered but determined Serbian army, fighting on its home ground, throws back the Austrians in 1914's winter battles, handing Vienna a humbling defeat. But Serbia's respite will not last long. Meanwhile, in the Carpathian Mountains and Galicia, brutal battles between Austria-Hungary and Russia see seesawing fortunes and appalling losses on both sides. From East Prussia's forests to Serbia's hills, the war is already proving to be anything but a quick, glorious adventure. By the end of 1914, the conflict has spread far beyond the fields of Europe. It has truly become a world war. In November, the Ottoman Empire formally enters the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, turning regional rivalries in the Middle East into another theater of combat. The Ottomans, once fearsome but now the sick man of Europe, hope alliance with Germany will stave off collapse and perhaps regain territory. They fight the Russians in the Caucasus Mountains and threaten Britain's lifeline to India by attacking the Suez Canal in Egypt, Across the globe, colonial forces are drawn in. Germany's overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific come under attack by Allied troops. In Africa, British, French, and Belgian forces, often with African soldiers in their ranks, seized German Cameroon, Togoland, and Southwest Africa within the first years of the war. Only in German East Africa does a crafty German commander, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, hold out, leading his colonial troops in a guerrilla campaign that will tie down Allied forces until after the war ends in Europe. In the Pacific, Japan swiftly captures Germany's islands and China holdings. From Europe's capitals to remote African jungles and Asian ports, battle is joined. The war is fought on nearly every continent and ocean, a truly global conflagration. Back on the Western Front, as the winter of 1914 sets in, millions of soldiers settle into the grim reality of trench life. The trenches are wet, cold, and infested with lice and rats. Soldiers learn to sleep amidst the thunder of artillery and to live ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in mud that clings to everything. Between the opposing trench lines lies no man's land, a desolate waste of barbed wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead. Every so often, commanders order men to go over the top, to clamber out of their trenches and charge the enemy lines. They do so into a storm of machine gun bullets and shrapnel that cuts them down by the dozens or hundreds. It is an industrial killing field, war mechanized by rapid-fire guns and giant artillery pieces that hurl high explosive shells for miles. Traditional gallantry has no place in this inferno. A charging cavalryman or a line of bright uniformed infantry stands no chance against the modern firepower that rakes the battlefield. Amid these conditions, a strange and poignant event occurs on Christmas Eve 1914. On parts of the British, French, and German lines, the guns fall silent as soldiers spontaneously hold an unofficial Christmas truce. Men crawl out of their trenches, not to fight, but to shake hands. They exchange small gifts like chocolate or tobacco, sing carols together, and even play impromptu games of football in the snow-dusted no-man's land. For a few precious hours, the soldiers on both sides recognize their shared humanity. But the truce is short-lived and never repeated. Officers soon crack down, and the war's relentless slaughter resumes. Still, that brief peace amid war becomes a symbol of hope and the tragic futility of the conflict. As 1915 begins, hopes for a quick resolution have vanished. Both sides are digging in for a prolonged struggle, searching for ways to break the deadlock. New weapons and tactics emerge from the desperation. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, the German army unveils a terrifying new weapon: poison gas. On an afternoon in spring, German troops open thousands of gas cylinders, and a green-yellow cloud of chlorine gas drifts across no man's land into the Allied trenches. French and colonial Algerian troops gasp as the gas sears their lungs, an agonizing, suffocating death for those caught without protection. Panic spreads, and a gap opens in the Allied line. The horror of chemical warfare has made its debut. Quickly, both sides develop crude gas masks and retaliate with their own poison gases. Phosgene, then mustard gas that burns skin and blinds eyes, unleashing these poisons to terrorize the enemy's front lines. By war's end, over 1 million soldiers will be gas casualties, though comparatively few, about $90,000, will die from it. The psychological terror and suffering inflicted are incalculable. The use of gas is a grim symbol of how this war pushes past old limits, science and industry bent toward ever greater destruction. Also, in 1915, the Allies try to break the stalemate by hitting the Central Powers where they might be weaker, the distant edges of their empires. In the spring, Britain and France launch a daring campaign against the Ottoman Empire at the Gallipoli Peninsula on the Turkish shores of the Dardanelles Strait. The plan, championed by a rising politician Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, is to knock the Ottomans out of the war by seizing control of the straits, threatening the Ottoman capital Constantinople, Istanbul, and opening a supply route to Russia. On April 25, 1915, Allied forces land on Gallipoli's beaches under heavy fire. British troops, along with soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, and French colonial forces struggle ashore into hellish conditions. The cliffs bristle with Ottoman defenders led by able commanders like Mustafa Kemal, who will later be known as Ataturk. What was imagined as a swift knockout blow turns into another trench stalemate, but this time on rocky, sun-baked hills with scant water. The Allies cannot advance inland. The Ottomans, suffering terribly themselves, cannot drive the invaders back to the sea. Month after month, soldiers endure heat, disease, and constant sniper and artillery fire. After 8 bloody months with no progress and some 250,000 Allied casualties, the Allies evacuate in defeat. Gallipoli is a disaster, particularly searing in the national memories of Australia and New Zealand, for whom this was their baptism of fire on the world stage. The failure leads to political fallout in Britain. Churchill resigns from his post, and the government of Prime Minister Asquith begins to totter. While in Turkey, it becomes a tale of heroic defense that boosts Turkish nationalism. Gallipoli has shown that the war's grasp is worldwide and that there are no easy victories to be had. Meanwhile, a new front opens in 1915 in the Alps. Tempted by promises of territorial gains at the expense of Austria-Hungary, Italy abandons its neutrality and joins the Allied side. Italy's declaration of war on Austria-Hungary in May 1915 throws open the Italian front. Here, Italian troops under General Luigi Cadorna face the Austro-Hungarian army along the mountainous Isonzo River and the jagged peaks of the Dolomites. War in these heights is a special kind of misery. Soldiers struggle to haul artillery to positions 10,000 feet high. Winter blizzards and avalanches sometimes kill more men than bullets. Over the next 2.5 years, no fewer than 12 battles will be fought along the Isonzo. Cadorna, rigid and uncreative in tactics, repeatedly orders frontal assaults uphill against well-fortified Austrian positions. The result is slaughter and stalemate. Thousands of Italians and Austro-Hungarians die for meager territorial gains that are often lost in the next enemy counterattack. Little changes strategically on this front in 1915, but the strain on the faltering Austro-Hungarian Empire grows, and Italy bleeds heavily as well, sowing disillusionment among its troops and people. As the land war churns on, the war at sea also intensifies in 1915. Britain's Royal Navy has imposed a strict blockade on Germany since the war's start, aiming to starve the German war machine of food and raw materials. German ports are bottlenecked. Over time, shortages begin to bite on the German home front. In response, Germany turns to its new weapon, the U-boat or submarine, to wage a counter-blockade. German U-boats prowl the Atlantic and the North Sea, targeting ships supplying Britain and France. In early 1915, Germany declares the waters around the British Isles a war zone. Then, on May 7, 1915, a U-boat torpedoes the RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner carrying civilians, without warning. The great ship sinks in minutes off the coast of Ireland, taking nearly 1,200 lives, including 128 Americans. The world is shocked. Germany defends the sinking by noting the Lusitania was carrying munitions, which it was. But the loss of civilian lives, especially Americans, causes outrage. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson protests vehemently. Fearing U.S. entry into the war, Germany temporarily pulls back from unrestricted submarine warfare, but the seeds of anger are planted among the American public. Though the United States remains neutral in 1915, it edges closer to the Allied camp, providing loans and supplies to Britain and France. The waves of war are slowly reaching across the Atlantic. By 1916, the war has become a terrible battle of attrition, each side hoping to exhaust the other. Two vast confrontations in 1916 will come to symbolize the war's senseless slaughter and indomitable will. The first comes in February, when Germany initiates a massive offensive against the French fortress city of Verdun. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, believes France can be bled to death. If the Germans attack a position the French feel honor-bound to defend, the French will pour men and resources in, and Germany can, in Falkenhayn's words, bleed France white. On February 21, 1916, a hellish bombardment, the largest yet seen, erupts around Verdun. Over 1 million shells rain down in the opening barrage, turning forests into splinters. German troops advance, and thus begins the Battle of Verdun, an inferno that will last 300 days. French General Philippe Pétain takes charge of Verdun's defense and becomes a national hero, instilling his weary men with the defiant motto, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. The fighting is ferocious and unrelenting. Villages are erased from the map under shellfire. Hills earn grim nicknames like Hill 3004 and Fort Douaumont, becomes a charnel house. Troops rotate in and out so frequently along the Sacred Way road to Verdun that by year's end, almost every French division is served at Verdun, many of them shattered. The Germans, too, suffer mightily as the battle sways back and forth with no decisive result. When the fighting finally subsides in December, Verdun's toll is staggering. roughly 300,000 killed, and perhaps 700,000 casualties total for a few miles of ground. Verdun has become a symbol of French national determination and of the war's utter devastation. Verdun will forever mean sacrifice and stubborn endurance. In the midst of Verdun, the Allies try to relieve pressure on the French by launching their own giant offensive. On July 1, 1916, British and French armies attacked German lines along the River Somme in northern France. The British, many of them volunteers of Kitchener's new army experiencing their first battle, walk across no man's land in broad daylight, confident that the week-long artillery bombardment has destroyed the German defenses. It has not. German machine gunners emerge. From bunkers, the shells didn't destroy and mow down the advancing infantry. That first day on the Somme becomes a byword for futile slaughter. The British suffer 60,000 casualties in a single day, 20,000 of them killed outright. General Sir Douglas Haig, the British commander, is horrified by the losses but resolves to press on. The Somme offensive continues through the summer and into the muddy autumn, turning into a grim grind similar to Verdun. The British introduce a new weapon in September, the tank, armored vehicles that rumble across trenches and barbed wire. The first tanks, however, are few in number and mechanically unreliable. While they sow panic among some German troops, they are not yet a war-winning weapon. By November, when the battle is finally called off, the Allies have advanced only a few miles. Casualties on the Somme exceed 1 million combined, another scale of carnage that defies comprehension. A German officer who endured the Somme wrote, "Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a more ghastly word." For Britain, which had entered the war with a small professional army now largely dead and replaced by citizen soldiers, the Somme marks a painful coming of age. It is a tragedy that sears the national consciousness much like Verdun does for France. While Verdun and the Somme dominate 1916 in the West, important events unfold elsewhere that year. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire shows that it is not yet knocked out. In June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov launches a brilliantly planned offensive against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia, present-day Ukraine. The Brusilov offensive achieves a breakthrough using innovative tactics, concentrated short bombardments and attacks along a wide front to prevent the enemy from shoring up weak points. Austro-Hungarian lines crumble, hundreds of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers are killed or captured, and the Habsburg army nears collapse. Germany rushes reinforcements to bolster its ally and staves off total disaster, but the toll is severe. The Austro-Hungarian military will never fully recover its fighting strength. However, the victory comes at a tremendous cost for Russia too. Brusilov's gains are not supported adequately by other Russian generals, and eventually the offensive loses steam. Russian casualties mount to horrendous levels, exacerbating discontent back home. Still, the Brusilov offensive is one of the war's most successful Allied operations, and it forces Germany and Austria to abandon any planned offensives of their own in the East that year. The strain of war by late 1916 is showing in every nation. That year, more players join, and others falter. In the Balkans, Bulgaria had joined the Central Powers in 1915 to help defeat Serbia, motivated by its own territorial rivalries. And together with German and Austro-Hungarian forces, Serbia was finally conquered late in 1915. In 1916, Romania, tempted by Allied promises of Transylvania, then part of Austria-Hungary, enters the war on the Allied side. But Romania's timing is poor and its preparedness lacking. The Central Powers rapidly counterattack. By the end of 1916, most of Romania is overrun, its oil fields seized by Germany. Romania is knocked out of the war, a stark lesson of how dangerous it is to join this war ill-prepared. On the home fronts, the long casualty lists and privations are shaking confidence. News of battles like Verdun and the Somme horrify the public. In Britain, Prime Minister H. Asquith is forced to resign amid criticism of the war's conduct. He is replaced in December 1916 by David Lloyd George, a dynamic leader who promises more efficient mobilization of society for victory. In Germany, the failure to win in 1916 leads Kaiser Wilhelm II to replace Falkenhayn as chief of staff with the duo Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the heroes of Tannenberg, who now effectively dominate German policy. They ramp up Germany's war effort in what becomes known as the Hindenburg Program, demanding total mobilization of manpower and industry. The year 1916 ends with a sense of stalemate and weariness. Millions are dead, economies are strained, yet neither alliance has achieved a decisive breakthrough. 1917 arrives with the world yearning for an end to the bloodshed, but it will prove a year of dramatic turns. Facing deadlock and starvation due to the British blockade, Germany makes a fateful decision. It will resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking all ships, including neutral ones, headed to Allied ports, in a bid to knock Britain out of the war by cutting off its food and supplies. German leaders know this strategy risks bringing the United States into the war, but they gamble that Britain will collapse before American intervention can make a difference. So in February 1917, German U-boats begin attacking every ship they can find in the Atlantic. The toll on Allied shipping is severe. Thousands of tons of merchant ships sunk each month. As feared, the outraged United States draws closer to war. The breaking point comes when British intelligence intercepts the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, offering a military alliance against the U.S. and promises of returning lost territories like Texas and Arizona to Mexico. When the telegram is made public, American opinion, already angered by U-boat attacks on U.S. ships, swings decisively in favor of joining the fight. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," now feels he has no choice. On April 6, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. In a stirring speech to Congress, Wilson frames the war as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. America's entry tips the global scales. The Allies gain a vast fresh reservoir of manpower and industrial might. However, it will take time for the U.S. to train, equip, and ship a large army to Europe. Germany hopes to win the war before the Yankees arrive in force. Even as one great power enters the war, another is on the verge of collapse. The strain of nearly 3 years of fighting is pushing Russia to the breaking point. Its armies, despite huge sacrifices, are undersupplied and weary. At home, food is scarce, inflation rampant, and public faith in the Tsar's government is crumbling. In March 1917, February by the old Russian calendar, revolution erupts in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Mass protests over bread shortages turn into a popular uprising. The Tsar's soldiers in the capital refuse orders to fire on crowds. Instead, many join the protesters. Nicholas II, seeing no way to retain control, abdicates the throne, ending centuries of Romanov dynasty rule. A shaky provisional government takes power, led by liberal and moderate politicians who promise democratic reforms. Crucially, they choose to continue the war, honoring Russia's commitments to the Allies. But the war effort is faltering. Discipline at the front deteriorates, and casualty-weary troops become increasingly demoralized. The Russian populace, including soldiers, peasants, and workers, desperately wants peace, land, and bread, as the slogan goes. Into this chaos returns an exiled revolutionary, Vladimir Lenin, whose Bolshevik party advocates an immediate end to the war. By the fall of 1917, Russia is heading toward a second revolution, one that will have dire consequences for the Eastern Front. On the Western Front in 1917, the Allies, buoyed by the prospect of eventual American help, are still trying to break the German lines. In April, the French launch a grand offensive on the Aisne River, led by General Robert Nivelle, who boldly promises that his assault will achieve la rupture, a decisive breakthrough, within 48 hours. Tragically, the Nivelle offensive fails, horribly. German defenses hold strong, and the French attackers suffer enormous losses for little gain. The setback triggers a crisis in the French army. Worn down by 3 years of futility, thousands of French soldiers in many units mutiny, refusing to make any more hopeless frontal attacks. They do not desert the front or abandon the defense, but they make it clear they will not advance in suicidal assaults. The French high command is alarmed. France is at the brink of military collapse from within. General Nivelle is sacked and replaced by General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, who understands the need to restore his men's spirit. Pétain addresses grievances, improving food, leave time, and living conditions for his poilus, infantrymen. He courts them with care, punishing ringleaders of the mutiny, but also promising that France will stay on the defensive until America's help arrives, and victory can be achieved without pointless mass charges. Gradually, order is restored. The French army holds its line. Meanwhile, the British take on the main offensive burden for 1917 on the Western Front. In the summer and fall, British commander Sir Douglas Haig is determined to grind down the Germans and seize key territory in Belgium. This leads to the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele. The offensive begins in late July 1917 after weeks of shelling that churns the battlefield into a cratered swamp. Unfortunately, one of the heaviest rains in years turns the Flanders lowlands into a quagmire. Advancing British, Australian, Canadian, and other imperial troops find themselves wading through mud that can swallow a man whole. Machine gun fire and artillery still reap their terrible harvest, but now even moving a few hundred yards can take days. The village of Passchendaele, sitting on a low ridge, becomes the final objective after months of slogging. By the time Canadian troops finally capture the shattered remnants of Passchendaele in November, the offensive has gained just a few miles at a cost of perhaps 500,000 casualties on both sides. Passchendaele becomes synonymous with the muddy hell of trench warfare and the relentless attrition that characterizes the Great War. A British soldier poet, Siegfried Sassoon, bitterly writes of the conflict, "I died in hell. They called it Passchendaele." The grim fight underscores how far the war has degenerated into an exhausting contest of endurance and suffering. Beyond Europe, 1917 also brings developments on other fronts. In the Middle East, after the failure at Gallipoli, the British have more success. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, British Indian forces regroup and capture Baghdad from the Ottomans in March 1917, a psychological blow to Ottoman rule. To the west, British General Edmund Allenby leads an army into Palestine. In a sweeping campaign employing infantry, cavalry, and even armored cars, he wins a decisive victory at the Battle of Beersheba, utilizing a daring Australian light horse charge, and breaks through Ottoman lines. By December 1917, Jerusalem falls to the British, a symbolic conquest greeted with enthusiasm back in Britain. Farther south, in the deserts of Arabia, an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, sparked in 1916, continues to gain momentum. Arab tribes, led by figures like Emir Faisal and advised by the eccentric British officer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, harass Ottoman supply lines and capture the strategic port of Aqaba. The Ottoman Empire, fighting on multiple fronts and struggling with internal dissent, is slowly being pushed back and weakened, though it fights stubbornly on. On the Italian front, disaster strikes in late 1917 for Italy. In October, Austro-Hungarian forces reinforced by German units launch a surprise assault at Caporetto, known today as Kobarid, on the Isonzo front. Using infiltration tactics and heavy use of stormtroopers and poison gas, they rupture the Italian lines. The Italian army collapses into a chaotic retreat. Soldiers, demoralized and ill-led, flee back dozens of miles. Only when they reach the Piave River, about 70 miles from Venice, does the Italian line finally hold, with help from rushing British and French divisions sent to stabilize the front. The Battle of Caporetto is an enormous setback. Italy suffers some 300,000 casualties, including many prisoners, and loses huge quantities of equipment. The shock leads to the ousting of General Cadorna, replaced by General Armando Diaz, who focuses on restoring morale and defending what remains of Italian territory. Caporetto stands as one of the war's greatest routes, but Italy, with Allied support and grit, manages to recover enough to continue the fight. The phrase Caporetto even becomes a synonym for a disastrous defeat. As 1917 ends, the strategic balance teeters on a knife's edge. The Central Powers have knocked out Russia and others, but their people are starving and tired. The Allies have gained a powerful new partner in the U.S., but one whose impact is just beginning to be felt. Crucially, in November 1917, a second revolution convulses Russia. Lenin's Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government in Petrograd. Lenin is single-minded about ending Russia's participation in the capitalist-imperialist war. Peace negotiations begin between the new Soviet government and the Central Powers. By March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed. Russia exits the war, but at a terrible price. The treaty forces Russia to cede vast territories: Finland, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and more. While this brings relief to war-weary Russia, now descending into civil war, it is a huge boon for Germany and its allies. Germany can now transfer hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the West, hoping to finally tip the balance before American forces arrive in full strength. It seems like Germany might have one last opportunity to win the war outright. Thus, we come to 1918, the climactic final year of World War I. The German High Command, led by General Ludendorff, plans a series of all-out offensives on the Western Front for the spring of 1918, a final gamble to shatter the Allied lines and force a victory. German troops, freed from the east, are reorganized into shock units trained in new infiltration tactics, moving fast, bypassing strongpoints, and spreading confusion. On March 21, 1918, Germany strikes in the misty dawn along the Somme front in an attack codenamed Operation Michael. A massive bombardment, including the terrifying use of stormtrooper shock troops, blasts open a gap and German forces pour through the British lines. Thus begins the Spring Offensive, also known as the Ludendorff Offensive. German armies drive deep into areas of France that had been quiet since 1914. In some sectors, they advance 40 miles, a breathtaking gain after years of stalemate. Paris itself comes under threat. German long-range artillery shells the city from nearly 75 miles away, and Parisian citizens scramble for cover as explosions thunder in the streets. For a moment, it looks like Germany might snatch a late victory. But these offensives, though impressive, gradually lose momentum. German soldiers, often half-starved due to the Allied blockade, outrun their supply lines and become exhausted. They also start looting supplies, food, wine, in captured areas, slowing their progress. Critically, the Germans haven't achieved their strategic goals. They haven't split the French and British forces or seized the Channel ports. By April, the initial surge wanes. Ludendorff launches additional offensives against the British in Flanders, then against the French on the Aisne in May, and one last push on the Marne in July. But each blow is weaker than the last as German casualties mount and their best troops become spent. The German army is reaching the end of its tether, having shot its bolt without breaking the Allies. The turning point comes in July 1918 at the Second Battle of the Marne. The Allies, now under a unified command led by French General Ferdinand Foch, successfully anticipate and repel the German offensive there. As German forces reel, Foch seizes the initiative. In August, the Allies launch a massive counteroffensive, beginning with the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918. On that day, a powerful combined force of British, Australian, Canadian, and French troops, secretly massed beforehand, strikes along the Amiens sector, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. The attack is a stunning success. German lines are breached, and thousands of German soldiers surrender voluntarily. Ludendorff famously calls August 8th the Black Day of the German Army. As it becomes clear the German troops' fighting spirit is cracking. This ushers in the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of Allied attacks all along the front. Day by day, the Germans are pushed back from positions they've held for years. The newly arrived American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing, plays a significant role in this final campaign. By late summer, over 1 million U.S. soldiers, doughboys, are in France, eager to prove themselves. They fight with determination in battles at Cantigny, Château-Thierry, and Belleau Wood, helping to blunt the German spring attacks. In September, American-led forces launched their own offensive at Saint-Mihiel, successfully clearing a German-held salient. Then U.S. troops joined the major Allied push through the Argonne Forest in northeastern France, part of a massive Meuse-Argonne offensive that lasts until the end of the war. Though inexperienced and suffering heavy losses, the American forces bring a vital fresh energy and manpower that the exhausted Germans cannot match. As the Allies press forward in the West, Germany's allies fall apart. In the Balkans, Allied offensive in September 1918, led by French, Serbian, and Greek forces, punches through Bulgarian lines. Defeated, and with Allied armies advancing toward its territory, Bulgaria surrenders on September 29, 1918. In the Middle East, British Empire troops under General Allenby win a decisive victory at the Battle of Megiddo in late September, encircling and destroying much of the Ottoman army in Palestine. Allied and Arab forces swiftly push north through Syria. The Ottoman Empire, its armies beaten in the field and its populace war-weary, signs an armistice at the end of October 1918, exiting the war. On the Italian front, Italy, revitalized under General Diaz and with Allied reinforcements, launches a final offensive in late October 1918. At the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, the Italian army decisively defeats the Austro-Hungarians. This victory is the final straw for Austria-Hungary. The centuries-old Habsburg Empire is disintegrating from within. Czechs, Slovaks, South Slavs, and Hungarians are all declaring independence or armistice as national sentiment boils over. Austria-Hungary sues for peace on November 3, 1918, effectively ceasing to exist as an empire as it breaks into several new states. Germany now stands alone, hemmed in and crumbling from within. The Allied blockade has caused severe privation on the German home front. Shortages of food and fuel have made life miserable. In October 1918, facing inevitable defeat, the German government attempts to sue for peace based on President Wilson's idealistic 14 points plan. But even as diplomats talk, Germany's internal order collapses. At the end of October, German sailors in the port of Kiel, unwilling to undertake a suicidal last mission against the British fleet, mutiny. Their revolt sparks uprisings across Germany as weary, hungry civilians and soldiers join calls for an end to the war and the abdication of the Kaiser. Revolutionary fervor spreads. In early November, workers and soldiers' councils seize control in several cities. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II bows to the inevitable and abdicates his throne, slipping across the border into exile in the Netherlands. German leaders of the new Provisional Republic send emissaries to France to negotiate an immediate ceasefire. In a cold, foggy railway carriage in the Compiègne forest of France, Allied and German delegates meet in the early hours of November 11, 1918. The terms are agreed upon. Germany will pull its troops from all occupied territories, surrender much of its weaponry and warships, and accept occupation of the Rhine West Bank. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice comes into effect. Across the battlefront, weary men hear an eerie new sound: silence. After 4 years of continuous thunder, the guns finally cease firing. Soldiers cautiously emerge from trenches, some laugh, some weep. Many simply stand stunned that it is truly over. In Allied cities, Paris, London, Rome, New York, ecstatic crowds celebrate, cheering and ringing bells. In defeated Germany and its former allies, the mood is more somber, a mix of relief and anguish. The Great War has ended. The world that greets the peace is forever changed. The cost of World War I is almost beyond measure. It claimed an entire generation. Roughly 10 million military personnel are dead, their bodies lying from the fields of France and Flanders to the mountains of Italy, the plains of Poland, the hills of Gallipoli, and the sands of the Middle East. At least 6 to 7 million civilians have also perished from war-related famine, disease, and violence. Millions more survivors carry wounds, disfigurements, or psychological trauma, known then as shell shock, an invisible and haunting injury of the mind after constant bombardment and horror. For those who lived through it, the war was an apocalypse. Towns and countryside across Europe are devastated. Northern France and Belgium's lovely villages and landscapes are now moonscapes pitted with unexploded shells and rusting barbed wire. Ancient empires have fallen in ruins. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone, fractured into new nations like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and a South Slav kingdom, later named Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, once spanning the Middle East, is no more. Its lands in the Middle East are parceled out between Britain and France as mandates, while Turkey emerges as a new republic after a post-war struggle. In Russia, the Tsar's empire has given way to revolution and civil war that will eventually birth the Soviet Union. The German Empire, too, has collapsed, its Kaiser ousted, and a fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, struggling to take root amid hunger, unrest, and a sense of national humiliation. 4 mighty empires have vanished in the span of a few months, redrawing the map of Europe and beyond. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers convene in Paris to hammer out the peace settlement. Leaders like Woodrow Wilson of the USA, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy argue over the spoils and terms. Wilson arrives as a prophet of a new, fair order. His 14 points advocated self-determination for nations, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to ensure future peace. But harsh realities and desires for retribution against the vanquished take precedence. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed on Germany in June 1919, is punitive. Germany is forced to accept sole blame for the war guilt clause. Cede territory. Alsace-Lorraine returns to France. New nations like Poland and Lithuania take chunks of German land. The Rhineland is to be occupied and demilitarized. Surrender all its colonies and pay enormous reparations for civilian damages. The proud German nation, exhausted by war and blockade, reels under these terms, which many Germans view as a diktat, a dictated peace they had no choice but to sign. Meanwhile, in other treaties, Austria and Hungary are carved up and disarmed. The Ottoman Empire's Middle Eastern lands divided under Allied supervision, and new states like Poland, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, born from the Russian Empire's collapse, are recognized. The League of Nations is established, aiming to provide a forum to resolve conflicts without war, though ironically the United States, turning isolationist, will refuse to join it. The peacemakers hope they have built a lasting peace, but in truth, they have also sown seeds of future strife through unmet national aspirations and resentments. For ordinary people across the world, the war leaves a deep mark on the psyche. There is a sense that an old world died in 1914 to 1918, and a new, uncertain one is struggling to be born. The war took sons, fathers, brothers from nearly every family and left empty chairs in every village church and town hall, memorials and cemeteries. And arise in every land touched by the conflict, grand monuments in capital cities and simple stone crosses in village squares, all bearing the names of the fallen. Poets and writers, many of whom fought in the trenches, seek to express the unspeakable. British poet Wilfred Owen, having experienced the trenches, wrote searing verses exposing the grim reality of war. In one poem, he directly challenges the old lie that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, describing a gas attack's victims and ending with biting irony. Owen himself would be killed in action just a week before the war's end, his parents receiving the news on Armistice Day. Another former soldier, Siegfried Sassoon, writes with angry sarcasm about the blindness of those who cheered the war on. Their war poetry and memoirs, like Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, from a German soldier's view, paint the war as a futile slaughter, not a grand adventure. A profound disillusionment settles over the post-war generation, a feeling that the sacrifice must not be in vain, yet also that the world had lost its innocence. Despite the despair, important changes in society emerged from the war's shadow. Women in many Allied countries stepped into roles left vacant by men at the front, working in munitions factories, driving ambulances, serving as nurses near the battlefields, keeping farms and businesses running. This wartime service accelerates the push for women's suffrage. Countries like Britain and Germany grant women the right to vote shortly after the war, in 1918 and 1919 respectively, acknowledging their vital contribution. Social class barriers are also eroded. In the trenches, nobles and laborers suffered and fought side by side, a leveling experience that makes post-war societies a bit more equal and open to change. Technology has leaped forward. The war spurred advances in aviation as flimsy 1914 biplanes evolved into 1918's faster fighters and bombers. Tanks and mechanized warfare emerged, pointing to the future of conflict. Medical advances were made in treating wounds and diseases. Radio communications improved. Yet these advantages came at a terrible cost and often to serve destruction. As 1918 turns to 1919 and then the 1920s, people try to rebuild their lives. Many struggle to find meaning in the chaos they endured. Annual commemorations like Armistice Day, November 11th, are established to honor the dead. In 1920, Britain and France each create a tomb of the unknown soldier, laying to rest an unidentified warrior to symbolize all those who never return. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, veterans' memoirs, monuments, and ceremonies keep the memory of the war's horror alive. A common hope is voiced. Never again. Never again should the world experience such a slaughter. And for a time, it seems that perhaps this hope will hold. The Great War is called the War to End All Wars, in the belief, or desperate wish, that humanity has learned its lesson about the devastation modern war brings. Yet, in a poignant and tragic twist of history, the peace that follows proves fragile. The unresolved grievances, particularly in Germany, where the stab-in-the-back myth spreads, falsely claiming the army was betrayed at home, fester and give fuel to new extremist movements. Economic turmoil, including the Great Depression, further destabilizes the world. 2 decades later, in 1939, the globe will be plunged into an even more destructive conflict, World War II, born in part from the embers of World War I's unresolved issues. The Great War thus stands not only as an immense tragedy in its own right, but also as the precursor to even greater upheaval. World War I remains one of the most significant events in human history, a turning point that shaped the modern era. It shattered 4 empires, redrew borders, and altered the international balance of power. The United States emerged from it as a leading global creditor in power, stepping onto the world stage, though retreating briefly into isolation after. The war also catalyzed or accelerated social changes. It helped usher in greater rights for women in some countries. It set the stage for advances in civil rights movements. For instance, colonial troops who fought began to question European superiority, sowing seeds for later independence movements, and it transformed warfare and technology. But above all, World War I is remembered for its unparalleled human cost and suffering. It is a somber reminder of how quickly the world can descend into chaos and how immense the costs can be. In the quiet of the former battlefields today, grass and wildflowers have grown over the scars of trenches. The fields of Flanders bloom with red poppies each spring, the delicate red flowers that sprang up amidst the churned soil and graves, memorably captured in the poem In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row. These verses, written by a soldier amid the carnage, voice both the sorrow and the duty of the living to remember the fallen. And we do remember. Strolling through the rows of white headstones at a military cemetery, or reading the names inscribed on a village war memorial, one cannot help but feel the weight of what was lost between 1914 and 1918. World War I changed the course of history and the lives of millions. In the end, the Great War's legacy is one of both warning and homage. A warning of how unchecked nationalism, militarism, and entangled alliances can ignite a blaze that consumes all in its path, and a homage to the resilience and sacrifice of those who endured its inferno. Over a century has passed, but the story of World War I continues to resonate, a dramatic, tragic saga of a world destroyed and reborn, and a stark lesson in the folly of war. As our documentary journey comes to a close, imagine standing at dusk amid the vast cemeteries of the Western Front, where the last light of the sun glints off rows of silent crosses stretching to the horizon. The evening breeze whispers through the trees as if echoing the voices of the young men who once laughed, fought, and died here. The world they knew was engulfed by the Great War, and in its aftermath, a new world emerged, one scarred by loss but yearning for peace. It is in the hushed silence of those graves and in the memories passed down through generations that the true cost and meaning of World War I live on. The lamps that Sir Edward Grey saw going out in 1914 were eventually lit again, but the darkness they endured reminds us always to cherish and guard the light of peace. The story of World War I is a story of human tragedy on a colossal scale, and a story we must never forget.